a three-part, as the brain evolved, it's kind of three parts. It's the thinking part, the social part, and the behavioral or doing part. And you could be gifted on the thinking part and just not have a clue on the social part, or you could be just great on the social part. People love you. You're the life of the party. But you can't think your way out of a paper bag, maybe. Right? So that's how I do it. When you look at children with autism spectrum, the higher functioning kids, typically their intellect is okay when they feel like letting you know what they know. So I don't make any pronouncements about their simultaneous processing, their ability to think and problem solve until they're into their teens. And I can make sure that they're really sufficiently motivated to share with me what they know, because they don't have that social contract. They're not as concerned about smiling at me, about making eye contact. They don't really understand, why do I care? Why do I want to know what they want to know? One little boy the other day is clearly what we would call Asperger, but we don't anymore, but fairly bright. I started asking him questions about just general knowledge and comprehension. He's 7, he looked at me and he said, boy, you don't know very many things. I mean, right? I mean, he couldn't figure out that, well, this isn't about what I know, and most 7-year-olds get that. But he didn't get it. He was just too inflexible in his thinking to get it, right? So there's that ability weakness. But all their other abilities, assuming they don't have any other co-occurring or comorbid problems, are normal, right? And typically, their acquisition of knowledge is idiosyncratic or spotty. They know a lot about some things that interest them, not as much about other things that interest us that we want them to know about. But they struggle to acquire social knowledge because they struggle with this basic genetically driven social ability, right? From an early age, it impacts them. And we really don't have any way of measuring the day in, day out effects it has. And when you look at the early immersion, I use that word myself, but you use the early preschool programs like Denver Star or CERTS. When you look at these programs that have now research success, they are every day, 4 to 6 hours a day, in a with a well-trained staff and a well-thought-out curriculum over 18 to 24 months. And they demonstrate that when you take a 3-year-old, it's prone to autism. Again, not so autistic that they're self-mutilating and you can't get them to function, but they're sort of there, but not really there. They make dramatic improvements. Are they still autistic? Sure. But in an emergent function way, one of the theories is that they have all the socialization genes that everybody else has, but they're not turned on. And experience has to turn them on, and they need a harder slap of experience, as it were. The typical experiences don't turn them on. But keep in mind, if you have a child who engages in repetitive play and you can shape their behavior to be more engaging and less parallel and more interactive, their genes haven't changed. Right? There's no genetic change that takes place when you take a child who starts out not participating and ends up being part of the group. The genes haven't changed. But I would argue that in some ways, some genes the child has have kicked on, have become more responsive to the environment, because what happens is you prime the pump, and they don't, if it was only what they learned, they would stay where they are. But they don't. You prime the pump, and then you watch over time, and they become more and more social, and they acquire new skills, and they begin asking, and they reach adolescence, and they begin asking questions about, young man I saw today goes to Rick's, and he's here on a vacation, or BYU, Idaho, and he's here on vacation, and he's autistic, and but he's in college, and we spent the whole hour today, talking about dating, because he wants a date, but every girl he goes out with, his thought is, could this be a wife? I said, how are you going to ever find anybody on a first date? Could this be a wife? And we made a list of criteria: if she's attractive, but what if she's attractive, but she has 4 cats? Oh no, I couldn't. He's just overwhelmed. But he's very analytical. So I said, well, let's make a list. But this is a guy who a year ago couldn't even talk to a girl, right? And so as he's acquired more skill, his knowledge has increased, but I would argue that his ability has increased as well. And someday we'll figure out, so what are the genes doing there, and how does all that work? So knowledge, ability, and then skill. And I find that's the biggest challenge. You know, I'll read you a poem here from the front of this book by a young man that I've worked with, who, and I'll get to what else I want to do here, but who's up in Wyoming in college. He's in his third year. He's doing pretty well. He's an interesting kid because he was a master at Pokemon, right? As a high schooler, he played Pokemon. His parents told him he couldn't take Pokemon to school, to college with him. Couldn't take the class. He was devastated. And I said, put a couple of decks in your bag, you'll never know. So he put a couple of decks in his bag. A week into school, he sends me an email. Guess what? I found 6 other kids with autism who like Pokemon. We started a Pokemon. So I asked him, what is it like to be you? And he wrote this poem for me 5 years ago. And it's, were they but there at night? There is a boulder field where every stone is a glazed, glittering gem like stars falling from the sky, all except one, a plain gray rock alone in the center. Feeling excluded and shunned, people come, tourists, painters, photographers, collectors, to view each shining boulder, a pleasure to the beholder. Ooh, ah, look at this one, come quick. Pockets bulge with fragments, and paint cans run dry. But the gray rock remains ignored, an ugly blotch on a sweeping mural. The sun sets, everyone leaves, and they miss the centerpiece of the field. For when night falls, the gray rock in the center glows in the dark. So I tell you this, you know, why do I read Devin's poem here? And he graciously allowed me to put it in the book. Of course, he asked if he was going to get a royalty. And I said, no royalty. He said, well, I don't know. I said, well, I'll find another poet to write a poem if you don't want to put your poem. Take it, it's a good deal. Okay. But why? So here's a kid who understands. He's acquired enough ability and knowledge to know he's still not skillful. And I don't think we're paying enough attention. This kind of is the roundabout, maybe finishing up this 40-minute introduction. But I don't think we're paying enough attention to the issue of skill. We're paying so much attention to symptoms and to behavior and to ability and to knowledge, but not enough attention to skill. And the data is a little dismal. And I'm a New Yorker, so if I hurt your feelings, I apologize. But the current data suggests that even with the better services and the better attention and the better programs, it's still the case that 50% of kids grown up today with autism live at home, and 2/3 don't work. So what are your dependent measures? What outcome measures? Is your outcome measure, oh, he's met his IEP goals? Is your outcome measure, you know, he's not spinning around anymore? What are your outcome measures? And for me, the big outcome measure is skill in adult life, making that transition and figuring out a way to function skillfully in adult life. And I still think we have a long way to go, and I don't necessarily, you know, have the answers to that. But we have a dramatic increase in children identified with autism. Do we have more autism? Lorna Wing, who since passed away, unfortunately, was sort of the pioneer. She coined the term Asperger's. And Lorna wrote 2 chapters in 2 of my textbooks on, you know, is there more autism? Is the incidence higher and is the prevalence higher? So incidence is what you measure in any one given moment. Prevalence is what you have over time, right? So the incidence and prevalence of ADHD are equal. The incidence and prevalence of depression are not, because at any given moment, only a small percentage of people are depressed. If you follow over time, you'll find there are other people who get depressed and other people who get better. So the prevalence and incidence vary. And what we're seeing is an increase in the incidence of depression. We've softened the diagnostic criteria. We've dramatically increased awareness in autism. We've legally mandated services. We have a state legislature that, you know, sometimes I'm astounded by their insight, who funds, you know, who are willing to fund programs and fund them again and try and, I mean, so there's going to be a push to say, hey, maybe my child has autism. Maybe, because if he has autism, then maybe I can get these services. And maybe, so there's a lot of reasons why the incidence of autism is increasing, but is the true prevalence of autism really increased? from a couple of percent in the population. And as a scientist, I don't think there's data to prove that.
How can you measure prevalence with a change in
Well, you
definition?
just have to wait over time. You have to say, take a 10-year block, and right.
Whatever you want to call it then is not what we call it now.
That's right. That's right. So it's hard to there's a lot of reasons why you can't measure. But here's how I look at it, because I always like this. For me, the simple is better. I mean, we did a project where we went out in the street on Main Street. This was a long time ago, and we asked people what is, and we used clinical labels like what is autism, what is ADHD, what is oppositional defiance disorder, and you get people there. And then we asked people, what is it like to feel so hopeless that you don't think you can solve your problem? Or what is it like to feel so worried that you think the outcome is going to be bad? Or what is it like to not understand how other people feel or think when you have to communicate with them? And when you ask questions in functional ways, everybody gets it. So we've created this nomenclature that is terribly confusing, that most people don't get. And why we continue with it, I don't know. But I would prefer functional descriptions. And I prefer the bell curve. So coming back to this issue, you know, if 9 out of 10 children in the classroom can pick up on the teacher's social cues and follow social leads and read, and you come into an environment and you have to figure out, you know, if somebody came in here from another planet and looked at this for a second, what would they conclude? Like, everybody's looking at me. You know, am I on trial? Am I giving it? You know, what can they tell by looking at you? You guys all look so somber because everybody's hungry, right? It's 6 o'clock and nobody's at dinner. You know, what do you read, right? Well, if 9 out of 10 kids can do it, but 1 out of 10 can't, that's 10% incidence of problems. I mean, what if it's, you know, what if it's 19 out of 20? Well, that's 5%. What is it? So when you say the incidence of social learning problems crossing the diagnostic threshold is a few percent, you realize what you're saying is it's 1 or 2 out of 100 kids. Well, I can find a lot more than that struggle with social pragmatics. So they meet full diagnostic criteria for autism. Again, you get into this debate in conferences. They get into this debate about you meet full criteria, and when we change the criteria, have we mucked it up? Have we taken kids who really have impairment and symptoms who should be served, and now they're not served? But you can make a social pragmatics diagnosis, which is autism without unusual behavior, basically is what it is, and they've created that. But I prefer a bell curve. If 9 out of 10 children can do it, and 1 out of 10 can't, I would argue that's a problem. Because in a classroom, the teacher teaches to the middle of the bell curve. The teacher manages to the middle of the bell curve. On the playground, it's the middle of the bell curve, right? And so if you're in the 1 out of 10, you have a problem. So if you ask me, you know, what's the incidence of autism, and you want to know the incidence of this kind of social learning adversity in the population, not the incidence of who crosses the diagnostic threshold, but the true incidence of this, then I would argue it's at least 10%. Does that make sense? In a bell curve way. We're not talking about a category. The DSM is a category, right? You have autism or you don't. Well, what if you have all the symptoms but one? You ain't getting a diagnosis, right? And yet you're probably almost as impaired as she is, and she has all the symptoms. And what if, I alluded to this earlier, what if the symptoms you have in an algorithmic way? What is an algorithm? An algorithm gives different weightings to things. So if you apply for a job with me to help me on my research, and your writing skills were important, and you had great recommendations, but you had 3 spelling errors in your resume, that's an algorithmic sign. You're out. Does that make sense? It weighs a whole lot more. And the fact of the matter is that when it comes to autism, certain behaviors are much more powerful in indicating impairment and problems over time when they're present. And when they're absent, they're also powerful in indicating better outcome over time. But the DSM doesn't work by algorithm. And so what if you don't have enough symptoms for a diagnosis, but the symptoms you have algorithmically are very predictive of trouble over time, and you have more than enough symptoms, but the symptoms